Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965 bersamaan dengan didirikannya Universitas Trisakti. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki 3 program studi. Program studi Sarjana Ilmu Hukum dengan 7 peminatan, program studi Magister Ilmu Hukum, dan program studi Doktor Ilmu Hukum. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Tisakti telah memperoleh akreditasi A sebanyak 5 kali berturut-turut sejak tahun 1998 dan telah memperoleh sertifikasi internasional dari ASEAN University Network atau Akun QA pada tahun 2021.
Program kekhususan hukum bisnis, hukum keluarga, hukum agraria, hukum pidana, hukum internasional publik, hukum acara, serta hukum pemerintahan dan perundang-undangan. Proses belajar mengajar dibimbing oleh dosen yang berkompeten dengan latar belakang akademisi dan praktisi hukum, serta didukung oleh pimpinan fakultas yang berkomitmen terhadap tercapainya visi misi.
Dalam menghadapi era revolusi industri 5.0, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti turut membentuk generasi kreatif, inovatif, dan kompetitif. Maka, kurikulum operasional dievaluasi berkala yang saat ini menggunakan kurikulum dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional berbasis outcome-based education, yang juga melaksanakan kebijakan pemerintah Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka, yang untuk percepatan dan peningkatan mutu luaran SDM, kami juga memiliki program Fast Track dengan strategi pembelajaran Student Centered Learning, dengan metode pembelajaran e-learning dan blended learning dengan memanfaatkan ketersediaan sumber belajar digital yang disiapkan oleh universitas, yaitu Pusat Pembelajaran Daring Trisakti.
Kurikulum yang diterapkan telah sesuai dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional Indonesia yang berbasis pada outcome-based education, serta mendukung program pemerintah yaitu Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka. Terdapat juga Fast Track Program yang merupakan program untuk meraih gelar Sarjana Hukum sekaligus Magister Ilmu Hukum yang dapat ditempuh hanya dalam waktu 10 semester.
Untuk mendukung pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki sarana dan prasarana akademik maupun non-akademik yang memadai, modern, dan selalu diperbarui demi mendukung pembelajaran blended learning. Sarana prasarana tersebut antara lain ruang kuliah, ruang laboratorium hukum, ruang auditorium yang memadai dan lengkap, ruang perpustakaan dengan koleksi kepustakaan yang lengkap, baik cetak maupun digital, ruang organisasi mahasiswa, dan ruang terbuka hijau.
Saat ini, Fakultas Hukum memiliki lebih dari 2.000 mahasiswa yang berasal dari 34 provinsi di Indonesia dan luar negeri. Hal ini menunjukkan adanya keberagaman budaya sekaligus tingginya minat masyarakat untuk menempuh pendidikan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Kegiatan kemahasiswaan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah dilaksanakan melalui lembaga kemahasiswaan, baik parlemen, BEM, OTF, dan komunitas. Berbagai prestasi telah diukir, baik tingkat nasional maupun internasional, antara lain peradilan semu, moot court, dan lomba-lomba debat lainnya, serta berbagai kegiatan olahraga dan seni.
Guna menunjang pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi dan program Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka (MBKM), Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti menjalin kerjasama dengan berbagai mitra kerjasama, baik di dalam dan luar negeri, yang meliputi perguruan tinggi, instansi pemerintah dan non-pemerintah, lembaga-lembaga negara, dan berbagai organisasi profesi di bidang hukum.
Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah mencetak lebih dari 14.000 lulusan yang bekerja di berbagai bidang profesi hukum. Hakim, jaksa, pengacara, konsultan hukum, notaris, diplomat, anggota legislatif, penggiat hak asasi manusia, dan lain-lain yang tersebar baik di dalam maupun di luar negeri.
Selamat bergabung di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Satu,
Dharma Perguruan Tinggi.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965 bersamaan dengan didirikannya Universitas Trisakti. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki 3 program studi. Program studi Sarjana Ilmu Hukum dengan 7 peminatan, program studi Magister Ilmu Hukum, dan program studi Doktor Ilmu Hukum. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah memperoleh akreditasi A sebanyak 5 kali berturut-turut sejak tahun 1998 dan telah memperoleh sertifikasi internasional dari ASEAN University Network atau AUN QE pada tahun 2021.
Program kekhususan hukum bisnis, hukum keluarga, hukum agraria, hukum pidana, hukum internasional publik, hukum acara, serta hukum pemerintahan dan perundang-undangan. Proses belajar mengajar dibimbing oleh dosen yang berkompeten dengan latar belakang akademisi dan praktisi hukum, serta didukung oleh pimpinan fakultas yang berkomitmen terhadap tercapainya visi misi.
Dalam menghadapi era revolusi industri 5.0, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti turut membentuk generasi kreatif, inovatif, dan kompetitif. Maka, kurikulum operasional dievaluasi berkala yang saat ini menggunakan kurikulum dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional berbasis outcome-based education, yang juga melaksanakan kebijakan pemerintah Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka, yang untuk percepatan dan peningkatan mutu luaran SDM, kami juga memiliki program Fast Track dengan strategi pembelajaran Student Centered Learning, dengan metode pembelajaran e-learning dan blended learning dengan memanfaatkan ketersediaan sumber belajar digital yang disiapkan oleh universitas, yaitu Pusat Pembelajaran Daring Trisakti.
Kurikulum yang diterapkan telah sesuai dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional Indonesia yang berbasis pada outcome-based education, serta mendukung program pemerintah yaitu Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka. Terdapat juga Fast Track Program yang merupakan program untuk meraih gelar Sarjana Hukum sekaligus Magister Ilmu Hukum yang dapat ditempuh hanya dalam waktu 10 semester.
Untuk mendukung pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki sarana dan prasarana akademik maupun non-akademik yang memadai, modern, dan selalu diperbarui demi mendukung pembelajaran blended learning. Sarana prasarana tersebut antara lain ruang kuliah, ruang laboratorium hukum, ruang auditorium yang memadai dan lengkap, ruang perpustakaan dengan koleksi kepustakaan yang lengkap, baik cetak maupun digital, ruang organisasi mahasiswa, dan ruang terbuka hijau.
Saat ini, Fakultas Hukum memiliki lebih dari 2.000 mahasiswa yang berasal dari 34 provinsi di Indonesia dan luar negeri. Hal ini menunjukkan adanya keberagaman budaya sekaligus tingginya minat masyarakat untuk menempuh pendidikan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Kegiatan kemahasiswaan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah dilaksanakan melalui lembaga kemahasiswaan, baik parlemen, BEM, OTF, dan komunitas. Berbagai prestasi telah diukir, baik tingkat nasional maupun internasional, antara lain peradilan semu, moot court, dan lomba-lomba debat lainnya, serta berbagai kegiatan olahraga dan seni.
Guna menunjang pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi dan program Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka (MBKM), Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti menjalin kerjasama dengan berbagai mitra kerjasama, baik di dalam dan luar negeri, yang meliputi perguruan tinggi, instansi pemerintah dan non-pemerintah, lembaga-lembaga negara, dan berbagai organisasi profesi di bidang hukum.
Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah mencetak lebih dari 14.000 lulusan yang bekerja di berbagai bidang profesi hukum. Hakim, jaksa, pengacara, konsultan hukum, notaris, diplomat, anggota legislatif, penggiat hak asasi manusia, dan lain-lain yang tersebar baik di dalam maupun di luar negeri.
Selamat bergabung di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965, bersamaan dengan berdirinya Universitas Trisakti yang dikenal sebagai Kampus Pahlawan Reformasi. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti terletak di Kampus A, Jalan Kiai Tapa, Jakarta Barat. Menempati Gedung H, Gedung Profesor Budi Harsono, terdiri atas 9 lantai dilengkapi dengan sarana prasarana yang mampu mewujudkan visi misi serta menunjang pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Tisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965 bersamaan dengan didirikannya Universitas Trisakti. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki 3 program studi. Program studi Sarjana Ilmu Hukum dengan 7 peminatan, program studi Magister Ilmu Hukum, dan program studi Doktor Ilmu Hukum. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah memperoleh akreditasi A sebanyak 5 kali berturut-turut sejak tahun 1998 dan telah memperoleh sertifikasi internasional dari ASEAN University Network atau Akun QA pada tahun 2021.
Program kekhususan hukum bisnis, hukum keluarga, hukum agraria, hukum pidana, hukum internasional publik, hukum acara, serta hukum pemerintahan dan perundang-undangan. Proses belajar mengajar dibimbing oleh dosen yang berkompeten dengan latar belakang akademisi dan praktisi hukum, serta didukung oleh pimpinan fakultas yang berkomitmen terhadap tercapainya visi misi.
Dalam menghadapi era revolusi industri 5.0, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti turut membentuk generasi kreatif, inovatif, dan kompetitif. Maka, kurikulum operasional dievaluasi berkala yang saat ini menggunakan kurikulum dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional berbasis outcome-based education, yang juga melaksanakan kebijakan pemerintah Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka, yang untuk percepatan dan peningkatan mutu luaran SDM, kami juga memiliki program Fast Track dengan strategi pembelajaran Student Centered Learning, dengan metode pembelajaran e-learning dan blended learning dengan memanfaatkan ketersediaan sumber belajar digital yang disiapkan oleh universitas, yaitu Pusat Pembelajaran Daring Trisakti.
Kurikulum yang diterapkan telah sesuai dengan kerangka kualifikasi nasional Indonesia yang berbasis pada outcome-based education, serta mendukung program pemerintah yaitu Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka. Terdapat juga Fast Track Program yang merupakan program untuk meraih gelar sarjana hukum sekaligus magister ilmu hukum yang dapat ditempuh hanya dalam waktu 10 semester.
Untuk mendukung pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi, Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki sarana dan prasarana akademik maupun non-akademik yang memadai, modern, dan selalu diperbarui demi mendukung pembelajaran blended learning. Sarana prasarana tersebut antara lain ruang kuliah, ruang laboratorium hukum, ruang auditorium yang memadai dan lengkap, ruang perpustakaan dengan koleksi kepustakaan yang lengkap, buka hijau.
Saat ini, Fakultas Hukum memiliki lebih dari 2.000 mahasiswa yang berasal dari 34 provinsi di Indonesia dan luar negeri. Hal ini menunjukkan adanya keberagaman budaya sekaligus tingginya minat masyarakat untuk menempuh pendidikan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Kegiatan kemahasiswaan di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah dilaksanakan melalui lembaga kemahasiswaan, baik parlemen, BEM, OTF, dan komunitas. Berbagai prestasi telah diukir, baik tingkat nasional maupun internasional, antara lain peradilan semu, moot court, dan lomba-lomba debat lainnya, serta berbagai kegiatan olahraga dan seni.
Guna menunjang pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi dan program Merdeka Belajar Kampus Merdeka (MBKM), Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti menjalin kerjasama dengan berbagai mitra kerjasama, baik di dalam dan luar negeri, yang meliputi perguruan tinggi, instansi pemerintah dan non-pemerintah, lembaga-lembaga negara, dan berbagai organisasi profesi di bidang hukum.
Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah mencetak lebih dari 14.000 lulusan yang bekerja di berbagai bidang profesi hukum. Hakim, jaksa, pengacara, konsultan hukum, notaris, diplomat, anggota legislatif, penggiat hak asasi manusia, dan lain-lain yang tersebar baik di dalam maupun di luar negeri.
Selamat bergabung di Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti.
Trisakti University is one of the most renowned and prestigious private university in Indonesia, which located at Grogol, West Jakarta. Trisakti University currently has 45 courses spread into 9 faculties. Those are 6 diploma programs, 23 bachelor program, 12 master program, 2 doctoral program, 1 special program, and 1 profession program located in a few campuses. The Campus A includes 7 faculties. Those are the Faculty of Law, Faculty of Economy and Business, Faculty of Civil Engineering and Planning, Faculty of Art and Energy Technology, Faculty of Industrial Technology, Faculty of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Technology, and Faculty of Art and Design. Trisakti University also has another campus, Place Kiai Tapa Street, Grogol, West Jakarta. The campus is named Campus B. It contains the Faculty of Medicine and Faculty of Dentistry. All of the faculties have been accredited and supported by comprehensive and complete facilities, so it could aid the student in very extensive studying process. Trisakti University is very focused and consistent in their educational efforts, supported by competent lecturers, reflected by the support of tens of professors and doctors, along with educators who most of them have at least master and doctorate degree. And more than half of them have professional certification. More than 100,000 Trisakti University alumni from all of the faculties spread into a very wide variety of professions, either in the state institutions or private sectors, and some also start their own business, domestically or internationally. The presence of the alumni opens up access and opportunity for newer students and alumni to have bright future.
Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965. Bersamaan dengan berdirinya Universitas Trisakti yang dikenal sebagai Kampus Pahlawan Reformasi. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti terletak di Kampus A, Jalan Kiai Tapa, Jakarta Barat. Menempati Gedung H, Gedung Profesor Budi Harsono. Terdiri atas 9 lantai, dilengkapi dengan sarana prasarana yang mampu mewujudkan visi misi, serta menunjang pelaksanaan Tridharma Perguruan Tinggi.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Tisakti didirikan pada tanggal 29 November 1965 bersamaan dengan didirikannya Universitas Trisakti. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti memiliki 3 program studi. Program studi Sarjana Ilmu Hukum dengan 7 peminatan, program studi Magister Ilmu Hukum, dan program studi Doktor Ilmu Hukum. Fakultas Hukum Universitas Trisakti telah memperoleh akreditasi A sebanyak 5 kali berturut-turut sejak tahun 1998 dan telah memperoleh sertifikasi internasional dari ASEAN University Network atau AUN QA pada tahun
exciting it is for me to be with you so easily without even traveling. And I've been hearing the sounds of beautiful birds. I know it's the morning for you. For me, it's the end of a long day. It's already dark, but it's cheering for me to see the sunlight and to see your faces.
It's different time, Prof.
So have you traveled recently, Tim? Out of town?
Not so much. I guess the last place I traveled that was overseas was Romania. So I was in Romania for a while, preparing for the World Congress of the Philosophy of Law, which will take place in Romania this summer.
So you're still the president for the associations, right?
I'm no longer the president. We have a new president. Matthias Malman is now president, and I have stepped down. And Matthias Malman is a professor at the University of Zurich.
So how do you involve with that association? So do you found it, co-found it, or?
No, it's interesting. It's more than 100 years old. So most of these associations for different types of things, like, for example, for international law or for comparative law, were founded in the 19th century, between 1850 and 1870.
Old, huh?
This one was founded, towards the end of the 19th century. And it's unusual in that it was founded by German speakers. So the name of the society, primary name, is actually in German. Internationale Vereinigung für Rechts- und Sozialphilosophie. So the most of these international societies are English or French or Latin, usually in their initials, but this one is German.
Right.
And it's because Germans in that time were very, very strong in philosophy. They're still strong in philosophy, particularly then.
Okay, but now probably has shifted to the North American, right?
Well, everywhere. The world is much. We have a global world now. I mean, that's one of the beauties. I wanted to talk to you, so it brings us together.
So I think maybe Oberta, or how should we start even?
Okay, let me take the floor. Is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so greetings everyone. Before that, I would like to provide some informations in Indonesia. Sebagai bentuk tata krama dalam pertemuan virtual, saya mohon kerjasama para hadirin untuk menyalakan kamera komputernya. Selain itu, bagi para hadirin yang ingin menyimak acara tersebut dalam bahasa Indonesia, silakan untuk mengklik interpretation dan memilih Indonesian. Dan untuk memastikan Anda agar mendengarkan suaranya dalam bahasa Indonesia secara jernih, silakan untuk mengklik mute for original sound. Sekali lagi akan saya tulis dan saya kopas di Zoom chat. Sebelumnya, saya berbahasa Inggris. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our scholarly legal speaking series, held by the collaboration of Faculty of Law Trisakti University and the Institute for Migrant Rights. I am Ober Tracy Chayadi, a final year law student at Trisakti Faculty of Law, and will be the host for today's discussion with Professor Mortimer Sellers of the University of Baltimore School of Law, namely, legal theories. What is it good for? The discussion will be led by Dan Trevenan, the program manager of the Institute for Migrant Rights and the host of IJIL's podcast. Without any further ado, let's get started. First, we will be having an opening remarks from the Dean of the Trisakti Faculty of Law, Dr. Siti Nurbaiti. You may have the time.
Thank you, Alberta. Can my voice be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes. The Honorable Professor Mortimer Sellers, Professor of Law, University of Baltimore, and former President International Association of Philosophy of Law and Social Philosophy, is a speaker. Good evening, Professor. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Good evening.
The Honorable Mr. Dan Trevenan, a Program Manager, Institute for Migrant Rights, and host of IJIL podcast, as a moderator. Good evening. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Bu.
The Honorable Mr. Pranoto Iskandar as a director and founder the Institute for Migrant Rights. Good morning. We met again, although via Zoom meeting. The Honorable Five Deans, Dr. Wahyuni Wulandari, Dr. Ning Adiasi, Dr. Bambang Suchondro, and Dr. Tri Sulistiawati. The Honorable all participants, I'm sorry I cannot be mentioned one by one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Best wishes for all of us. Salam Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good morning and good evening. Peace of all, let's give thanks to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, the Almighty God. We are still given a healthy blessing, long life, so we can attend general lecture as part of the lecture series with Timmy Legal Theories. What is it good for? Tuesday, the 26th of April 2022 via Zoom meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be here with all of you. Focus discussion today is a legal theories as a lecture series, and this event is collaboration between Faculty of Law, Trisakti University with the Institute Migrant Rights. This event also an implementation of the law faculty's vision, namely to make reliable the law faculty with the international standard. In collaboration with Institute for Migrant Rights, this lecture series is one of our initiatives in response to effort integration of Indonesian legal education into the global scene. For the information, in order to achieving international standards goal, since April 2021, we had obtained international certification in the form of ASEAN University Network Quality Assurance. Thus, we hope in the future, Faculty of Law Trisakti University and Baltimore University can establish cooperation in form of Memorandum of Understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, in relationship with the legal theories, as it is, we know that legal theories has emerged from time to time, from classical time to the end of the 21st century, from natural law theory to the progressive legal theory. This requires critical reflection on legal thinking in the world of legal education in Indonesia. So in this context, it's very important even to listen the general lecture that will be delivered by Professor Mortimer Sellers as an expert in field of legal theory and also an expert comparative and international law. Why? Because all the students and the participants have to understand, participants have to know about concept of legal theory, have to understand and how to the implementation the legal theory in the research or writing a thesis and a dissertation. Most the students still do not know how to implementation for this. The legal theory has very important position in the research, writing thesis or dissertation as analytical knife to reveal legal phenomena, both at normative and empirical level. In this short time, I hope all participants can make the best use of this moment, like as a lot of questions, discussion to gain understanding of legal theory. With a clear understanding of the implementation of legal theory, Indonesian legal scholars can develop their knowledge. In the future, I bullish on trajectory of the placement Indonesian legal scholar in the global map. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is the end on my speech. I said thank you and the higher appreciation to the Professor Mortimer Scheller, who has been willing as speaker, even though it is already night. Thank you to Mr. Dan Trevanian as a moderator. Also, thank you to all participants who have been present this general lecture. And congratulations to the organizing committee of this event who has been working hard to prepare this event. I hope this event can be useful for all of us, and especially to Professor Mortimer Sellers, will be willing to come back again in the next series. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Such a delightful speech given by Bu Siti Nurbaiti. Well, rights, the time is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to present this welcoming remark, and thank you to Ibu Dekan and Trisakti Faculty of Law and her Trisakti team for making this initiative to happen. I believe that this initiative will be a watershed moment in Indonesia and perhaps beyond. For what it is worth, increasing integrations of the global Republic of Letter. It is represented, among other, by the creation of the European Academy of Legal Theory in Brussels, which has now been followed by the creations of an African Academy of Legal Theory. But none of those happened in or hasn't happened in the context of Asia. Supposedly, this directly points us to a clue that any constructive initiative toward the creations of a true global Republic of Letter is on horizon. Considering that legal theory is also foundational in legal scholarship, it is fitting to devote this inaugural lecture to be dedicated to that particular subject. Admittedly, as I can recall, Tim and I have talked about this particular challenge at length 2 years back. There's a little doubt for that matter. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce you Professor Mortimer Scheller, or Tim. To my mind, and I believe to many other legal scholars who are familiar with Tim's scholarly work, Tim is one of the world's best legal minds that we have. And the most convenient way to confirm this is that we can just simply Google his name. But in this opportunity, I want to present my own take. To see it from disciplinary boundary, Tim's work range from, to name a few, history, philosophy, international relations, and political science, and of course, jurisprudence. So how can a mortal like us can make sense of Tim's eclectic body of scholarly work? My answer to that particular question comes down to this. Tim's common thread running through his numerous and varied work is an attempt to present an answers to big questions that have been echoed by many luminaries through the ages. Meaning, Tim's scholarly work are essentially a series of steps that simplify big and complex questions so that they become digestible to their reader. At the heart of this work, there is a claim that can easily be differentiated from other work. To be precise, this claim is what I call as theory, and the process to get there is what I call as theory building. To get a better sense of what I just talked about, let us consider one of Tim's latest work. In a book entitled Parochialism, Cosmopolitanism, and the Foundation of International Law, Tim recasts an age-old questions on how one can understand the role of the particular and the universal can manifest and perhaps be dealt with in the conceptions of international law. In this vein, international law is seen as an aspiration to being universal or founded on the assumptions that there is such a thing that we call universality. But at the same time, the reality on the ground does not agree with that propositions. Time and again, the fact has stubbornly sided with the plurality of human realities or experience. This question is not only theoretically challenging or interesting, but more importantly, this can unlock the way forward to our inevitable future as one community. With that background, it should be clear that the primary goal of this inaugural lecture is to unveil how Tim's mind works so that he can ceaselessly churn out interesting thought that is worthy for publications. By being worthy publications, it means they have passed the quality control and are eligible to be included in the menu of our food of thought. Turning to Dan, who will serve as Tim interlocutor, I would like to say that Dan is the best talent who can bring out the best in Tim that I can think of. So far, in particular, for the last few years, Dan has been responsible for managing the podcast of the journal that I edit. Throughout the year, Dan has undoubtedly been the instrumental part of the IMR in order to be a well-functioning initiative. Overall, I can attest to all that since I've been working with Dan for almost a decade now. So enough said, let us turn to the main event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pranoto, for the speech. Now, finally, we come to the main session. Let us begin with the legal speaking series with our Professor Mortimer Sellers, accompanied by Mr. Dan Trevenant. But before that, if you have questions, please write them on the Zoom chat. And please to be as clear as possible in articulating your questions. Well, without any further ado, let us begin now. And you can have the time, Mr. Dan Trevenant.
Thanks, Alberta, and thank you to Trisakti University and Bu Siti Nurbaiti for the opportunity to have this wonderful conversation with Tim. I think we've sort of answered the question that we're all here for, legal theories, what is it good for? Well, it brings together people from around the world to one spot to have a fascinating and illuminating discussion. So I'm really keen to progress this. But Tim, where I might start, just to ground our discussion, is a little bit of background on yourself, because as with all scholars, as with all people, we bring our own life experiences to our work, to our thoughts, to our thinking. And I'm really curious where you started thinking about law, started thinking about legal theory, and started pursuing it as a student and then into your career as well.
Well, that's an interesting question, and one I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer, because as far as I can tell, the questions I'm thinking about now are the questions that have interested me as long as I've been alive. And so, it's hard to think that they at some point came into my head. I will tell you one thing about the law, perhaps. How is it that the law is part of my philosophical journey? I think when I was a child, I questioned my father very often. And so he said to me at some point, you ask too many questions, probably you have to be a lawyer. And so maybe I got the idea into my head very young for that reason. But in fact, I didn't train as a lawyer until I already had done a lot of training as a historian and a philosopher. And so a second motivation for becoming interested in the law was that I married someone who came from another country and another culture. And I was trying to think of something that would span the world, where I could live in her country, in my country, or in any country. And really, law and legal issues are like that. Everywhere in the world, we have to think about how our lives are organized. And everywhere in the world, we have to try and make that organization better. And a lot of the questions that we ask are the same questions. And so I think that is what really made it, in the end, my profession. And I became a professor primarily of law rather than of philosophy and history or some of these other subjects that I study. All subjects are connected, of course. But I focused on law because I think I see it as the way that we can unite the world and have a peaceful world. And those are things that matter a lot to me. And that's the reason why I am particularly delighted to be in your company, because this is exactly the sort of thing I hoped to do when I became a lawyer. So I'm very pleased that this is happening.
I'm going to pick up that point a little bit later, because in one of your, I think it was a speech, or it might have been one of your works, you sort of posited that the root of law is love. And I think some of that's coming through in what you're saying there. But if we just sort of stay a little bit on your background, I'm fascinated because you've studied at various institutions, you've taught at various institutions as well. What's it like having that experience across cultures in different environments? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you speak a few languages. Latin, I think, has come up in my research.
Well, I speak a number of languages badly, including my own. But, and in thinking about that, I sort of lost track of the question. The question, repeat it again.
How's your experience across cultures, studying in various institutions?
Oh, yeah. So you don't understand anything until you cross cultures. You don't understand your own culture until you cross cultures. Because we grow up in a world that we take completely for granted. Everything makes sense because that's the way it is. And it's only when you have the opportunity of living in another place or talking to people who come from another place that you realize what is special about your own world and your own family and life and culture and everything is unexamined until you look at it from the outside. And so I think you to understand yourself in a way, you have to travel, because otherwise you're trapped within yourself and you don't see yourself from outside. So that's the great benefit to me of travel and studying in other countries and studying other languages and meeting people who come from other places. It's a way of discovering about yourself, who you are, and then discovering the ways in which you may be making mistakes or be wrong or assume something to be true, and you realize by talking to another person that it never was true. And so that's it's the benefit of having friends, it's the benefit of meeting people, but I think that this is particularly beneficial when you go to other places. And I'll just add to that I have, in every society there's good and bad, and there are people who are trying to make things better and some people who are maybe not helping as much as they should to make things better. And it's often in other countries that you find people who are trying to do the same thing that you're trying to do in your own country. In other words, you can be trying to do things in your own life, in your own country, and you don't feel maybe that they're appreciated or received well as they should be. But then you meet another person in another place, in another culture, who's trying to do these things that you also are trying to do, and it gives you courage. So I take courage from seeing brave people in other places and what they do. It makes me stronger in trying to improve the society in which I live.
I think that's an excellent thought, and I know there's people are listening to this lecture at the moment who they're thinking about going overseas and studying, and I think that's a wonderful opportunity to take. But if we take the sort of courage now to actually a difficult topic, legal theory, where do we go from here? How would you start that conversation, Tim? How do you describe legal theory, say if you're teaching a class to Lawyers 101 or Students 101?
I think legal theory is the easiest and most interesting part of law. Just the question, what ought we to be doing? So what is it, and what ought it to be? And what ought it to be is a very interesting question, because the purpose of law, the meaning of law in every society is justice. And so how do we make that true? How do we make that real? I think it's something that every human being cares about. I've never met a person who didn't care about that. We all care about it. And then, so in some ways, it's the simplest course to teach, because every student I have has thought about this already, and every student I have cares about it already. And with legal theory, without legal theory, there's no law. I mean, law has to make sense. And the job of legal theory is to make sense of law, to have it be something that we can understand and that we can value. So I think every lawyer is without purpose if they don't take an interest in legal theory.
So if we dive in a little bit, when I was in law school, the common practical problem we were given is the signpost of the law in the parks where it says no vehicles allowed. And then there's a question of, well, that means you can't drive your car into the park. That seems obvious. But what about riding a bicycle through, or being on an electric scooter? Or what if there was an old World War II tank, which was a statue in the park? Would that be allowed? These are some of the, I guess, things that we could see in everyday life that come from the question of what should this law ought to be in a very simplistic sense. How do you find having that discussions with students? Do they start to light up and engage with this conundrum? Because I've also seen the experience of students who just say, we're just talking in circles about what this law could be. It's obvious. You just can't drive a car into a park.
Well, actually, I'm in that camp too. I'm with the students with that reaction, because it seems to me a very simple question. And I think it only becomes complicated if you take an extremely positivistic conception of what law is, which in the end becomes incoherent. So law is a purpose of enterprise. We have law for a reason, and that reason is to serve the well-being of the community, to achieve the common good, to achieve justice. So if you're asked to interpret a law, you interpret it in the light of its purpose. And so a question about vehicles in the park, I mean, the question immediately, why are we prohibiting vehicles in this park? Well, I think the reason we're prohibiting vehicles in this park is so people can stroll happily and appreciate the beauties of nature and talk to each other, which is the reason why we have parks. So if someone comes in with a car, or if someone comes in with a dangerous vehicle, or, you can imagine any, but would we allow a woman to push her baby in her carriage? Yes, because so much in keeping with the purpose of the enterprise. When I think of a park, I think of a family walking together, and in fact, I imagine the baby should be in the carriage. So, I think having some kind of grasp of legal theory and the purpose of law makes what might have been difficult questions actually very easy. And, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, so one thing you're touching on there, I think, is some of the different institutions involved with the lawmaking process, because we have legislators that would make that law, and now we're talking about interpreting it, which is the role of judges. How do you see that dynamic working out as a legal theorist?
Well, they all have the same duty, which is to achieve the purposes of law.
Sometimes it feels like they're working at cross purposes, though.
They shouldn't be. And much of law, most of law, the most important function of law is when you interpret it yourself. In other words, the law is communicating to citizens, and it's telling them what we value and what we think is important, and we're advising them how to serve each other. So this rule for the park is interpreted primarily by the citizens who see it. And then they have that thought: what is the purpose of this rule? And I would hope that the baby carriage and the mother would enter without any hesitation, because it's so obvious that we have the park for their benefit before anyone else. And so, the same thing for legislators and for judges. When legislators serve any purpose other than the common good of everyone in society, when legislators serve any other purpose, then they have betrayed their calling. They've betrayed their duty as a legislature. And when a judge interprets the law in any other light than for the well-being of the people, if the judge interprets to assist a particular political party, or if the judge is assisting some ideology that is not shared, then the judge is betraying their role as a judge. So I see judges, lawyers, legislators, people who are all working in the same enterprise. And if we act in good faith, which is the essence of law, good faith, then we won't come into conflict.
Mm. I really like that as probably a centering point for the discussion about legal theory. What is it good for? Because I think a criticism could be made that, yes, that all sounds fantastic in theory, but in practice I could point to examples in some jurisdictions and say, well, look here, the judge wasn't working in furtherance of the common good, the common purpose. How does legal theory help us, and what is it good for in those situations where the theory seems to break with reality?
Well, there are a number of questions. So I think I guess the first thing, what I've said already, and I really think it's true, is that the most important questions are not difficult. All the most important things we all know. Every one of us knows it. Some of us pretend not to know it, some of us hide it. But we know We know what justice is. We know what the common good is. We know what it is to respect other people. We know these things. So, so the most important things are not difficult. But yet, at the same time, we all have to admit that we are human beings, that as human beings we make errors, that our judgment fails, that I make myself often failures of judgment, all of us do. And so we have to have the humility to try to find systems that can make us more confident that the law that we have is good law, that our interpretation of the law is good interpretation. And that's even just for people who are of good will. But unfortunately, sometimes people act without goodwill. And we have the situation in society. And again, because we are human, where all of us want things, things that we know we shouldn't have, but we still want them. And we try to get them sometimes when we know we should not do that. So we try to create structures of government to create laws that are good laws. It's not enough for us to think, each of us individually, what would be right. We have to have a system to clarify collectively. So it's not just a question of principle. That's what I've been talking up until now is principle. What are the fundamental principles? It's also a question of institutions. How can we build institutions for our society that will achieve justice for everybody? And unfortunately, that is a battle that we will never win. For all of history, we're gonna fail to reach our principles fully. But in every generation and in every year and everybody's life, we have to be constantly fighting to move in the direction where our institutions actually serve justice. So that's hard, but it's not just about principle, it's also about institutions. So legal theory gets closer to political science when we're talking about how we actually achieve. And the same thing goes for legislation. Legislation can't just describe what is beautiful, but it has to find a way to get there. And that requires social science. It requires a lot of knowledge about the world. And it requires a lot of willingness to cooperate and to listen and to include every member of society. Because if for whatever reason we don't listen to some person, then we're going to miss the things that would help that person. If you ignore somebody, you're going to treat them badly. You have to hear their voice. And that's hard, again, very hard to do.
I think that sort of brings up, at least Google and my research has cast you as a Republican legal theory. And I think what you're talking about there really does bring out, Republican legal theories about considering what legal rules and procedures will implement the common good of the people most completely or most well. How does that theory position itself against some of the other well-known theories that we're taught in law school, natural law theory, the positive school? How does that all, where's that on the spectrum?
Well, I think my theory includes all the other ones. I really believe we actually all agree under the umbrella of because what Republicanism, I guess, what it means is this idea that government and law are for the common good, for the public good. That government and law are for the public good of everyone. And I have never met anyone who was willing to disagree with me about that. In other words, everybody thinks that law is for the public good. Everyone thinks the law is there for justice. Because even though the governments don't act that way sometimes, they always claim that that's what they're doing. Because if they don't claim that that's what we're doing, then we're going to reject them. All of us want government that is serving the public good. That's what we all want. And so even the governments that are corrupt and are doing terrible things, all of them will say, we are a republic. Almost every nation calls itself a republic. And the ones that don't call themselves a republic say that they are still serving the public good, even though they don't call themselves a republic. So by saying that people should serve the public good, I think I'm just saying something that everyone can agree with. The other techniques you brought up are techniques that you use within this bigger purpose to achieve the bigger purpose. So natural law theory is the theory that there are truths about justice that can be discovered by human minds. And I think that's obviously true. I don't think anyone can contradict that. There is truth about justice. When we see oppression, when we see people violating the rights of others, hurting other people, we know that it's wrong. Everybody knows that it's wrong. On the other hand, in order to make it a reality, it's good to express it and write it down on a piece of paper and show it to people so they can understand it. And so that's the value of what people sometimes call legal positivism. It's good to posit laws. It's good to make a statement and try to capture these truths. And there's more than one way to organize a society. And so you have to make certain choices. And you have to explain which choice you've made. So all of these different theories and utilitarianism, it's the idea that law should be useful. Well, of course law should be useful, But these are all techniques under a bigger umbrella. So that's why I think that's why I use the word republicanism, because I think everyone can agree with republicanism. Everything can fit under that umbrella. And the only people I disagree with, there are two types of people I disagree with, I guess. They're the people who say there's no truth about justice. It's just doesn't matter. We could choose that we want to hurt people, or we can choose that we don't want to hurt people. It's a matter of, it doesn't matter which one you choose. To me, that's not true. Nobody really thinks that. We all know that you're not supposed, so the people who say that seem silly to me. And then there's some people who claim, they call, the word might be used, libertarian. They say everybody can do whatever they want, and that includes harming other people if you want to. We all do whatever we want, including harming other people. And to me, that also is so unpersuasive, because we all know we're not supposed to harm other people. And so, but I don't think the people who say that they have those views really have those views. If you talk to them, you come to realize they don't believe what they're saying. They're just saying it because it's entertaining. So my conviction, and I think it really is a valuable and useful thing, is that two people who talk to each other sincerely about law and justice can easily find much common ground. And I never met a legal theorist where I didn't find common ground quickly. And I never found a human being where I didn't find common ground quickly, unless they just refuse to talk and refuse to think and refuse to treat me as a human being. They just treat me they just refuse. When that happens, it's very sad. But it's rare, because we're social animals as human beings. We want to talk to other people. That's why I'm so glad to see you. I want to reach you. I want to connect with you. I want to understand you. And so I think sometimes we make it sound too hard to find common ground. When people don't find common ground, usually it's because one of them is just refusing, because they maybe want to do something bad, and they just refuse to even try to understand the other person. And again, that's sad.
I wanted to pick up that point on that sort of first group of people that you feel like you just can't quite agree with. And I want to sort of play with the idea a little bit about justice and how it changes over time. Because, in Australia, where we are, and I know in various other jurisdictions, there's a growing discussion around what we do call it sort of reparations, or making good the transgressions of past governments towards Indigenous people in those jurisdictions. And that stems from a different conception of justice at various points of time in history. How do you see that dynamic as a legal theorist?
Well, I think two things can happen. One is we can be wrong. Yes. And if you look at history, you can see many times when people were wrong. So I think that we've seen many societies where certain groups are treated badly. We've seen many societies that had slavery, We've seen many societies that oppress certain groups. We see many societies where women are not treated well. We see many societies that do bad things. And so, and we look at our own society and we look at the history of our own society, and we can see that we have done bad things, just like we can look at our own life. Just like as a human being, you can look at your own life and you can say, I did something wrong. Or I had an opinion that was really incorrect and I need to correct it. So the first thing that can change is that. So when you talk about reparations in Australia or in the United States or somewhere else, it's because we look at something and we said we did something wrong, and we have to say we're sorry, and we have to show we're sorry. We have to make things good if we can make things good. So that's one way I think that theory can change. It can change because we realize that we were mistaken and made a mistake. But another way it can change is the situation of the world around it changes, so that you actually need to have different justice. So, I mean, to one level you could say justice never changes. Justice is justice. But justice is justice according to the circumstances of the culture and the situation. So a rule that would be a very good rule and very just in the United States might be very unjust in Indonesia, because the situations in the two places are simply not the same. And so you have to look at the situation. But in neither place would you ever be able to call it justice if you were maltreating some group of people. If you're maltreating some group, treating people badly, that's not justice. Justice requires inclusion of all the affected people, taking them all into account. So in response to what you said, yes, I think justice can change because it's different in different places. The situation is different in different times, in different places. But injustice is always present and has to be corrected. And if you have committed an injustice, you have to apologize. It makes the world better. And so many times in my life, I've done something wrong. And then I said to the person who I harmed, I did something wrong. I harmed you, I'm sorry. And that is so easy to do. And then they forgive you. And then you're happy and they're happy. Everybody's happy. So we have to remember that that can also happen at a social level when the society has treated somebody. Every society that survives and still in our society. And we do that often through law.
I really appreciate that response, because for me it feels like we're taking an issue which people talk about in the news as a society, and then we're using legal theory to sort of just unlock it and open up the avenues for responses. Because once you do recognize something as injustice, then the pathway forward seems so much more clearer, so much more illuminated.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry.
Well, I was thinking I'll just turn the page slightly. We might go down a different track, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, Tim, is international law. And before we were talking about having the right institutions, the right processes in place to implement common good for the people most completely. And international law, I think, can be fairly criticized as having slightly weaker institutions compared to the domestic counterparts, and isn't addressing certain situations of clear injustice, which we can see in the news today, very well. How do you view international law as a legal theorist?
Well, the same way I view all law.
Yeah.
But international law is really important because we are all human beings, and we are one community of human beings. And it hurts me to know that someone is suffering some other place. And we care about each other. Everyone in the world, if you see a child suffering, you always stop to help the child. You can't see it. You can't pass by. You see another human being suffering, It's terrible because we are social. We want to be connected to other people. We are connected, and not just human beings. You feel the same way for animals, for anything. So that's why we need a just society. We need a just society so we can all be living worthwhile lives together. And one of the societies we have is global. We have a global society with other human beings. And of course, we also have much more local societies, and they're important, both of them. And when you develop a legal system, usually the first thing you develop is the principles. So that's why when we were talking today, we started by talking about principles. But there also need to be institutions. And the institutions, for example, in the United States, are highly developed. They've been developing for hundreds of years. I'm not saying they're good. I'm not saying they're certainly not perfect. They may not even be good, but at least we have institutions that are trying to do something. And if I have a quarrel with another person and I'm not able to solve it by conversation and we want to go to a judge to solve our problem for us, we can do that. And we'll feel pressure to behave well because the law tells us how to behave well or tries to help us behave well. But in international relations, although I think the principles are well known and the content of international law is well known, the way of controlling bad behavior is not so strong, and particularly bad behavior by the powerful. So in international relations, states are the main actors. And some states, for example, the United States, have a great deal of power. And that means when the United States behaves badly, it's hard to correct because it's too powerful. And so what we have to try to do is build institutions that inhibit bad behavior, even from the powerful. But I think just the same thing is true for states that's true of society. Even if you're a very strong and powerful person, you have much wealth, you have influence. If you do bad things, you're going to be unhappy if you're a bad person. And people are going to try and stop you and prevent you. But you won't be, and the same thing with countries. Countries that behave badly do not thrive in the long run because they know, their people know, they have to see that they have behaved badly. So for example, you gave the example of Australia, and if it had treated the native peoples of Australia badly, I think all Australians feel that to some extent, and they want to do something about it. And the same thing in the United States or any country. But just like people can be slow to correct themselves, states also can be slow. So it would be better if we had institutions that held them responsible. It would be better if we had institutions that inhibited them from bad behavior. And that's something I really think we all have to work on. I mean, a large part of my work is trying to develop institutions that will make justice real.
And I think that answer or response really made clear to me something I picked up in an earlier answer you gave, where you premised natural law and positivism as techniques. And as I'm thinking about that answer you just gave about international law, how do we make it stronger? How do we make it better? That's where positivism has a role to play as a technique, in that it makes certain rules, obligations more certain than perhaps international law is doing at the moment. And that was the subject of, I think, a paper you sort of gave about the positive response to complexity in international law. Did you want to dive a little bit deeper into that way of thinking?
Well, we spend a lot of, so I am an international lawyer, so I'm a philosopher and I teach as a philosopher, but I actually am also a lawyer and I work as a lawyer. And one of the main things that I care about and work on is the development of multilateral treaties. And a multilateral treaty is a treaty where many countries are party to the treaty. And very often these multilateral treaties are created for the purpose of restating something that we already know is the law, something that is already recognized as customary international law, or something that is already recognized as general principles of law that are accepted by nations across the world. But to make them more clear, we get excellent scholars, the scholars on the International Law Commission, often scholars working for national bureaucracies, and they try to draft clearer and better expressions of these rules. And then all the countries in the world agree, or many of them agree, in a treaty. And then the countries that don't agree still know that this is the best description that we have of what the rule is. And it makes a rule stronger if you state it clearly and well. And that's why I try, when I write, for example, to make things simple. Because if you state things clearly and well, then people can do it. And if you make it very complicated and confusing, then people can't do it. So the job of lawyers is to take things that look really messy and make them simple and clear. And that's what good lawyers do. And it's also what good philosophers do. And so that should be our aim. That should be our purpose. And if you make it both true and simple, then people can do it. And, then the world is better. So that's good.
Couldn't agree more. I think when I talk to my non-lawyer friends, which I have many, I don't try and exclude, but I think a common complaint they have is when the law seems impenetrable, when it seems like they look at a paragraph and they couldn't tell you what that law is if they tried. Do you feel like that's something that we're getting better at or worse at? Because I know in certain jurisdiction, there's many complaints that we're over-legislating, and now there's laws for everything. But I do think if I look at drafting from years ago, we have made leaps and bounds in terms of how we express ourselves as lawyers.
Yeah, I think one way to handle that is to have a hierarchy of norms. So we have constitutions, and the constitution should be simple and clearly drafted. And then we could have certain fundamental laws that elaborate the Constitution. So if you have these sort of higher norms that are clear, then they can be a way to cut away the confusion with lower order norms. Because it's very hard to convince legislature not to make rules about everything. They can't help themselves. And so that's maybe part of it, is try to have like a simple that everyone can understand, and things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of you should have a copy. You can look at it, and then you know that these are rights that the whole world agrees you have. Around you and say, does this match what's supposed to be happening? So I think these clear statements of basic truths are really valuable. And there is this problem, not just with lawyers, but with every field, that we're all studying something together, and we invent our own language, and then no one else can understand it. I'll tell you a story. When I was young, I thought, well, if I'm going to do philosophy, I should understand German. So I went to Germany, and I entered something called the Goethe Institute, where they teach German to foreign people. And I was there with many other foreign people. We were from every country in the world. And we were learning German, and we were all talking to each other only in German. And then we were speaking very freely with each other, and we were discussing philosophy and important topics, and all of this in German. But then we went to the bar and we tried to talk to actual German people. They could not understand a word what we were saying because we had invented our own language. Between ourselves, we invented our own language. It worked very well, but it wasn't German. And the same thing could happen with legal English, that the lawyers are all talking to each other and they invent some kind of English that's legal English, but it's not good because the people can't understand it. And so as lawyers, one of the things you have to think is, am I clear? Am I still in touch with the people? Because if you're not, then the law won't be effective.
I wanted to stay on this point just as we sort of finish up, and I'm leaving plenty of time for questions at the end. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your process as a legal theorist, as an academic. So we've talked a little bit about being lawyers as practitioners, but for some of the people who are listening into this, can you describe how you take an idea and then start to write about it, how to flesh it out, how to see the counterpoints and address them in a coherent and consistent way?
Well, Pran and I were talking about this actually just before we started this conversation, because the question is really, how do you decide that you have something to say that's worth other people listening? You know, how do you decide that you have something to say that is useful or interesting? You know, and what I do is I read. I'm interested in, let's say I'm interested in some general question. Then the first thing I do is read other people who wrote about this question. And I try to see which ones I think are good. The ones I think are good, I try to figure out who are the people I think are really good. And I find the ones I think are really good. And then I try to understand where I disagree with the people who I think are good. And that's where I probably have something original to say. Like, these are people who I think are really good. I really agree with them. But here's some point where I don't actually agree. And for me, that means actually, I probably have something useful to say. So that's how I discover what I have to say. So it's no fun just to write a paper saying I agree with this person and that person and this person and that person. More interesting is to say, I really respect this person, but I don't think he's right about this or that. And so I guess that's how I decide what to write about. And the other thing is, I never really expect that anybody will read any word that I write. I really don't expect it. I grew up, it's maybe, I don't know how it is now, because I don't know if people spend as much time in the library. But for my childhood, from when I was young until for a long time, before they had the internet, I spent all my time in the library, and I would find these books that were 100 years old. Nobody read them for 100 years. And then I would look at them and I would think, oh, this is pretty good. And so that's what I was thinking. I think I'm writing something now. It will go in the library. Maybe nobody alive cares. Maybe I'm going to die and nobody will have read the book. But 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, maybe somebody will read what I said and think that it's interesting. So I don't actually seek an audience that much. And that may not be smart, actually. That may not be wise. I mean, like, my wife is always saying you should write for the newspaper more, then people will read, you know, what you say and so forth. But I think, no, let them read me if they want to. If they don't want to, they don't have to. And then every once in a while, you know, I discover people are really interested in something that I said 10 years ago, 15 years ago. For some reason, it becomes relevant to the conversation and people are very interested. And then, of course, I'm very happy, you know, they care what I said. But I'm not thinking that they're going to care when I write it. When I'm writing it, I'm thinking, I want to say what's true. I want to say what really is right. And then if someone reads it, I'm even happier. Even happier.
I think that's really powerful, because it's a bit of a contrast with the idea of social media, and I think everyone wants to be heard now, they want to be seen now. But the original social media, which is, you know, Pran was mentioning the Republic of Letters, but the publication of a book which will endure does have an audience broader than social media because it endures with time. And so I might conclude on that point by asking, what are some of the theoretical discussions that you see that perhaps are in the past and are bubbling up, or things that you haven't actually seen that the next generation of scholars, the students, are sort of bringing to your attention and maybe getting a little bit of your interest?
That's a very hard question. Because it is true that, you know, people ask you a question that you cannot answer. And that gets you thinking, you know, what is the solution to that problem? You know, so now I'm thinking about the younger scholars, you know, people I've talked to recently, what they did and how did it get me thinking. I mean, one of the things I really, and then some of these people I'm thinking are younger scholars, you know, they're getting to be pretty old people, actually. This question of legitimacy is very important. And I think younger people maybe care about that, or they should, but I think they do. And that is, you know, don't just accept the legal system that you're given, but you have to ask, what is this legal system worth caring about? Is the legal system that I have worth caring about? Or would I rather have a different one? You can't, and that's a question I think students have to ask themselves. So since some of you are students, many of you are students, a student is the time when you decide what your life will be. Student is the time when you decide what kind of, how you're going to live a worthwhile life that you feel proud of, how you're going to be something that you're glad to be for the rest of your life. And if you're going to be a lawyer, you're committing yourself to law. And so one of the questions you have to ask is, what is it about law that makes me proud? What is it about law that makes me want to be a lawyer? And if you look at your system and you say, oh, the law that I'm studying is oppressive, the law that I'm studying is not legitimate, then you have to figure out how you live in a system where the law is not fully legitimate and yet you are still a good lawyer and a good person. And so these are really important questions, particularly for young people. And they're questions that my students ask me and my students want me to consider. And I agree with them. So I think that maybe the older you are, the more you take inspiration from students, because your students remind you what are the most basic and important questions. Important thing, how can I make it so that it's good and worth it? How can I, as a lawyer, have a career? So I told you, I admit there are many flaws with the legal systems that I practice in. American constitutional law, international law. The main things I work on are flawed, but I'm trying to make it better. Mm-hmm. So legitimacy is something that students always remind me is important.
No, I think that's a fantastic place to finish up this section of the talk. What is legal theory good for? I think improving our lives, making our systems better is a fantastic sort of principle to hold. There's several questions in the chat. So I've noticed that, I don't know if you need a glass of water or anything, Tim, because there's a fair few here. Feel free to take
I'll take a little drink right now. Yeah, but I wasn't able to look at the chat, but so if you could just ask me questions from the chat and then I'll answer them.
Will do. So this one is from Rudy Natamija from the University of Lampung. How important is it to include historical material in the undergraduate law curriculum? In Indonesia, I think the history of law at the undergraduate level is rarely discussed. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tim?
Yes, I think it's really important. It's also rarely discussed in the United States. So we're like Indonesia in that respect. But I think you can't really understand the law unless you understand how it came to be, why it is the way it is. Even though we interpret things from history sometimes completely differently today than the way they were originally imagined and intended. But I think you really can not understand the law unless you know where it comes from. And the other thing that's good about the history of the law, because the past, I'm sure you've heard it said that the past is a different country, but the past is a different country. So just as when I go, let's say I go to Indonesia, then I see the United States better because people ask me questions that I didn't even think of myself, or criticize, see something wrong with the United States that I didn't know because I didn't think about it. And the same thing is true of early time in your own country, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And you can see what they were talking about. And sometimes actually through their eyes, you can criticize today. And you can see things today that are wrong because you look at it of the eyes of 100 years ago. And you can also look at them and see how they were wrong and how we can avoid their mistakes. But it goes in both directions. So just like comparative law is good, so I think the history of law is good. I wish in our law schools we did it more. And in fact, in my law school, I persuaded them to require it. So now they have to do it. But that's not typical. They didn't used to have to do it. Today actually was the last day of classes So I've given 7 lectures already today, all of them summing up. And one of them was legal history, and telling them what I'm telling you, that this is really powerful, really powerful. If you know the legal history, you can really have, it's a lever to change what's happening today.
A second question, this is from Bu Amriati from Trisakti. When we were talking about sort of common good for people as the essence of law, this could be said to be a very natural theory perspective of law. Is that something you agree with, Tim? And is this sort of general principle of common good for people something that we should be teaching more in our universities?
Usually some discoverable right choice about what is better or not better. I mean, obviously we make mistakes, but we should think of it always in that way. And I think that people should tell the students that all the time. So I do tell the students that all the time. I also tell the students all the time that they don't have to believe me about anything, that they shouldn't just, that in other words, I'm just giving them points of, I'm getting them to think what they think for themselves. And you don't want to accept what your teacher says. You want to question what your teacher says. Even if you really agree with your teacher, just like I said before, even if you really agree, you have to look for where they're wrong, because that's how you grow and that's how you see new things, and that's how you surpass your teacher, which is what the teacher wants. The teacher always wants you to surpass them. So it's wonderful when the student tells me, you made a mistake, and then they convince me that I made a mistake, then I'm really happy, because then I know they're thinking. So yes to both your questions. Yes, I think there is discoverable truth about legal and moral questions. And yes, I think the common good is really the basis for all of that. Justice is the common good. Justice is how do you structure a society so that everyone can live a worthwhile and fulfilling life. That's what justice is. And you can look at any society in the world and ask that same question. And in every society of the world, you can find ways to make it better.
A third question, I'll take the second part of this one. This is from Muhammad Ibrahim. What can academics or students from countries in the global south, like Indonesia, do to make a contribution to the field of legal theory? Do you have suggestions for people who want to study or research on legal theory from this part of the world?
Well, if you're really interested in legal theory, I think you should try, first of all, see if your nation, I don't actually know about Indonesia, so this may be actually advice of something that really you could do. I don't know if Indonesia has got a branch of the International Association for the Philosophy of Law. I don't know if there is one or not, but there certainly should be one. There certainly should be one, because then if there was one, people in Indonesia would talk to each other. The professors and others would talk to each other about legal theory, and then they would take the result of their knowledge and they would give it to the world through the general organization. So there is this International Association for the Philosophy of Law. It has branches all over the world, and they have World Congress every 2 years. The one this year will be in Romania. The next one will be Argentina, but it moves around the world. At one time it was in China. It's been in Japan. So we try to move to different parts of the world. And obviously it's difficult to travel long distances, but you can read anywhere, and you can send messages anywhere. So I would say, start to discuss these questions amongst yourselves, amongst your faculties, amongst your students, and then share your opinions with the rest of the world. And you will find that in every country in the world, there's somebody who is interested in what you're doing. And that's nice, because then it will make you, because I'll say something else that, not every colleague I have on my faculty actually thinks what I do is important. Not every colleague on my faculty is reading my books. not every colleague on my faculty, wants to talk to me about my work. So, and that's true probably for you too. If you love legal theory, you may find that some of your colleagues don't love legal theory. And if you think it's important, you may find some do not think it's important. But if you talk to people in other countries who are trying to do what you're trying to do, it makes you feel stronger and it gives you support. And it makes you think, what I'm doing is good. So one reason for the global South or the global anywhere to be connected to the global anywhere else is for that you find that you have sisters and brothers in every other country of the world who's trying to understand exactly the same problems that you are trying to understand, but just in a different place and from maybe a little bit different perspective. And then they can learn from you. So that's great.
Another question, this is from Anna Marie from Tisakti as well. This is, I guess, a little bit more about that conversation we had about how your process of writing about legal issues, legal theory issues. Anne-Marie is saying when she starts writing, she starts to think about the legal theory on which to base her analysis. You got an object of the research, and then you can assess it from a legal positivism view or a different view. In some universities in Indonesia, they'll use 3 theories to sort of analyze a particular research object. What do you think about this approach where, I guess, less tied to a legal theory, but you're looking for the right lens that you want to apply to it?
Yeah, well, that could be helpful. There's so many different ways to write. I hate to be definitive. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, the writing in the 12th century, he said, this is what Aristotle says. This is what his critics say. It's exactly the technique you're talking about. In some, I'm not really sure whether this ever would happen in Indonesia, but in some societies where Islam is important, they look at different, like there are 3 or 4 different schools, and you might say this school says that, this school says that, this school says that. You might look at it that way. So I think comparing different approaches is not necessarily a mistake at all. But the way I do it is I just use my approach. And then, but you're right that because, so positivism, for example, you mentioned positivism, is useful if you're trying to figure out how to codify something and put it into a code. There's a lot of wisdom in positivism for that, project. And if you're trying to figure out what are the first principles, I think natural law plays a huge part. And if you're trying to resolve questions where they're more or less neutral in the legal and moral standpoint, but you're looking at society as a whole, a utilitarian approach might be valuable. So I think it's legitimate I think it's useful to be aware that there are different approaches. Different approaches are more or less useful depending on what it is you're trying to do at that moment. But I always love to go, I can't help myself, I just always love to go to first principles, because I don't think you understand anything until you get to first principles. And then that always takes you back to quasi-naturalist questions, probably.
Yeah. I'm probably going to keep going away with questions for about the next 5 minutes, if that's all right, Tim. Mm-hmm. I feel a little bit like a cross-examiner, so feel free to slow me down.
No, I have fun. I'm loving this. It's great. And I can only see 4 faces of the audience, but I'm loving to watch them too. So
this one is from Tamita Tiffany, also from Tisakti. What do you think about restorative justice? How do we apply it properly? And Tamita is saying that this is a sensitive issue in Indonesia at the moment, so she's interested in your thoughts.
Okay, well, first of all, I'll say that I'm not very well informed about restorative justice, but it comes up both in international law and in domestic law in the United States. And so there's different ways of, before I say anything, I want to say I'm speaking from ignorance. So that's important that you know that, okay? So don't believe me at all. Taking a broken situation and making it better. So in the domestic context, we do it with certain types of felons or people who have definitely committed crimes and caused real harm. But you're trying to create a world where those same people will still exist and not be a threat to society. And so how do you create a world for that person that takes them away from doing harm? In other words, you're not looking at punishment anymore. You're looking at somehow restoring the situation. And that can be rather complicated, and it's not something I do, but actually right next to my office, I have a research center, and I have a number of offices with my staff in there. And then next to me is another research center, and that research center is a center studying children, family, and the courts, and how the courts handle children and families. And in that center, they're talking a lot about restorative justice. Because when you're dealing with young people or families, very often what you're trying to do is just change the dynamic so that harm doesn't keep happening. And harm that's done to each other by members of a family, you want to avoid destroying the family, but how do you do that once one of them is behaving or some of them, So restorative justice could be a way to create a situation. And the other thing could be after a civil war or a civil conflict where the terrible things have happened, but you're trying to create a society where people who have done bad things can still live together with people who were their victims and suffered. And again, it's not exactly the same as direct justice, because restorative justice sometimes forgives injustices, or doesn't forgive them, but tries to absorb them. So I've just given an answer, although I'm completely ignorant. So whoever asked the question should remember that.
I think we'll have one more, and this is from a lecturer at Trisakti, Yunita Sugiastuti. And I think this is a good one because we haven't touched on this. So do you have any thoughts about the difference between common law countries and civil law countries, where Indonesia is a civil law country, America would be a common law country, and Germany, which I think you've done some work with, is a codified civil law country. How does that difference between codified rules, which are stable and more predictable in some ways than common law, how do you think about that issue in terms of different legal systems?
Well, I'll say, first of all, I think that the distinction between common law and civil law has really diminished in my lifetime, and even before that a lot. When I think about common law and civil law, I think basically of England and Rome. Rome was civil law. Basically the Code of Justinian is the ultimate civil law, jus civilis. And the English developed their common law at a time when the Europeans were receiving Justinian's code. The English didn't. They stayed with these sort of primitive tribal customs, and that generated the common law. And I guess the advantage of the common law in an earlier period was that it was more adaptable to new situations. And so that was a benefit for the common law. And the disadvantage for the common law was that it was being developed in a very haphazard way by often very ignorant people. So, the developments, you got a whole lot of stuff that was all over the place, and it therefore could be more arbitrary and perhaps in some ways less just. On the other hand, the problem with the civil law, particularly if you look at its Roman heritage, was, although it was pretty well worked out and actually incredibly sophisticated, really impressive even in Roman days, they did have this fundamental principle, which was that, quod princeps placuit legis habet vigorum, which means what the prince wants, that's the law. So you have these very well-developed laws that were originally developed actually in Rome by judges, just in the same way that eventually happened with the common law in England. But you also had this background principle that was super positivist in a very dangerous way. So the weakness of the civil law countries has been their tolerance for dictators, basically the way they can be taken over from the top. Whereas in the common law, from a very early period, they established the principle that this goes back to it goes back all the way to Magna Carta, but the king is sub deo et lege, which means the king is below the law and below God. So in the Roman hierarchy, the emperor at the top could always change everything and do everything. And in the British hierarchy, the king was controlled and had to respect the law. So I personally think that good codes are really important. I love codes. I love a well-defined and scientifically well-defined legal system. One thing I love about civil law countries usually is that they respect law professors and listen to them carefully. Common law countries don't listen to law professors so carefully or respect them so much because they listen to judges. So the law professor is more important, I think, mostly in civil law countries, and the judge is more important in common law countries. But I think the two systems have been working so closely together for so long that most of what is good in the civil law has become part of common law, and what is good in the common law has become part of civil law. So I think most civil law countries would now say that all the rulers are indeed below the law. You don't have many common law, many civil law countries that just say the ruler is at the top and everyone has to respect that. And you don't have many common law countries have a lot of codes, criminal codes, all kinds of codes, because of the clarity and the scientific approach you can take in developing a code. most of my academic friends are in civil law countries, so I guess I got seduced at some early age. I do have a degree in civil law. I mean, I have a Roman law degree, so I have a civil law degree as well as common law degrees. So I guess I'm in two worlds, and I'd say that I work a lot with Brazil, for example, where they've been trying to receive some aspects, good aspects from the common law into their civil law system. So
fantastic.
I love them both.
Well, I like how this has sort of brought a circularity to our talk, where we started with a discussion about the internationalization of our profession and how we can bring ideas together from across the world. And that's where we sort of ended up as well. So it's been fantastic talking with you, Tim, and I'll join everyone. I'm not sure if the automated applause will go off behind me, but we really do appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Well, I want to thank you too. I want to thank all the students who were there. I want to thank the deans. I want to thank Pran. I want to thank you. It's been a pleasure for me to meet you, and I'm very excited to know that you're thinking about these questions. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you so much. Alberta, I might hand over to you to close up.
Yes, you have 5 minutes for the conclusion. You may have the time.
Oh, I'm going to conclude. Well, I think I just wanted to end on a couple of quotes which I took from Tim's work in my research, which came out very, very clearly in our discussion, which I was glad of. And that was, the purpose of law is to realize justice, and law only has value to the extent that law does so. And justice is a set of rules which makes it possible for members of society to live full and worthwhile lives. And if we go back to the question of this conversation, legal theories, what is it good for? I think it's the pursuit of full and worthwhile lives for not only ourselves, but everyone else in our communities, whether around us or internationally as well. So I really thank everyone for joining us in this discussion, and I hope we've inspired you to take away some ideas and pursue them yourselves too. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again, all of you.
And we're just going to have a photo before we all hop off. Is that right, Alberta?
Yes. Okay. So we have been come out to our last session already. Let us have a photo session before, and please open your camera so that everyone photos can be taken. Para hadirin semua, mohon untuk menyalakan kameranya untuk sesi foto kami. Okay. I'm going to tell you, we have like several slides. We have 5 slides actually. So I'm going to take from the slide first slide. Okay. Okay, 1, 2, 3, cheers. Second slide, 1, 2, 3, cheers. Third slide, 1, 2, 3, cheers. The fourth slide, 1, 2, 3, cheers. And the fifth one, 1, 2, 3, cheers. Okay. Thank you for your participation as well. So, at last, because we have come up to the end of the session, on behalf of Trisakti Faculty of Law, I would like to express once again our gratitude to Mr. Sellers for sharing his knowledge and wisdom with us. And of course, I totally understand that it's getting late in Baltimore. Of course, on behalf of the Trisakti Faculty of Law, I would also like to thank our audience for the cooperation and having the engagement with us. Since today's event is actually inaugural of the Legal Speaking Series, then we expect to be a bi-monthly event. I'm expecting that we will meet again soon. For more information, audience will be provided further information through email and WhatsApp. We would also like to apologize if there are some words are off the limit. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor
Bye-bye.
Seller.
Bye-bye. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Prof.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.